All right, hello and welcome. Raf Diallo here from RTÉ Sport. And just over a year ago, before the 2022 FIFA World Cup kicked off, we examined some of the off-field issues in Qatar, particularly around the rights of migrant workers. But what has changed since in the year since the tournament, and what are the concerns about 2034 with Saudi Arabia set to host that edition of the World Cup? Last October, I spoke to Amnesty International's head of economic and social justice, Stephen Cockburn, about issues in Qatar, and with Amnesty recently releasing a report called A Legacy in Jeopardy, continuing abuses of migrant workers in Qatar 1 year after the World Cup. I'm delighted to be joined by Stephen again to revisit what we discussed before and casting ahead to what lies ahead in the future. Stephen, thanks very much for taking the time.
No, thanks for
And
having me.
yeah, this is going to be essentially a follow on from our chat last year. And I guess one of the questions, actually, the last question I think I asked you at the time was what your concerns were in regard to what happens when the eyes of the world and especially the world's media moves on after a year, 2 years, whatever. Now we're a year on, obviously, and obviously the eyes of the world has moved on to other issues that are happening around the world in terms of human rights and workers' rights. But from the Amnesty report, and the conclusion I'm taking from it is that the sense of progress in Qatar around those issues has stalled, and also that it's sort of shifted from the construction sector to the service industry.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, just to kind of recap, I guess a few years before the World Cup, there were these very big promises of quite potentially transformative reforms in Qatar in terms of changing labor laws, increasing minimum wage, better health and safety legislation, increased freedom for workers to move around, which really had the potential to improve the lives of hundreds of thousands of workers. And we saw some progress ahead of the World Cup towards that, but actually nowhere near enough, and still widespread abuses that persisted when the tournament kicked off. We've obviously continued to follow what's been happening over the last year and continue to do our research in Qatar. Our overall conclusion is there's been a few areas of small progress, but largely the momentum feels like it's been lost. And there's a risk that this potential legacy that was there could be squandered. There has been, we've seen slightly better enforcement, for example, about workers and working in the midday sun, or in the midday hours during the summer. That's probably better enforced than it used to be. But a lot of the promises around enforcing laws on wage abuse, for example, or on recruitment fees, or on a whole range of other issues, just really haven't moved forward. And it feels like there's a bit of stagnation going on. And there was a burst of activity in the years on the World Cup, but obviously the media spotlight moves on, the public spotlight moves on, and it does. We are worried that that things have slowed down quite drastically.
Yeah, and some of those issues, as you mentioned, we might delve into one or two of them in more detail. But the restricted ability to change jobs, which was a problem leading up to last year, still continues to be an issue. High rates of wage theft as well on top of it, and the investigations in regard to the deaths of workers. There's still problems there. And also, I think the mention of the trade unions, again, migrant workers can't join trade unions in Qatar. But what is the biggest impediment you feel on all of those issues overall, or what is the recurring theme that you would see?
Yeah, I think there is an economic background in the country as well. There's been a big, there's a construction, a lot of the construction, a lot of the energy behind that has stopped, and there's a bit of an economic squeeze that also provides excuses for businesses who want to cut costs on their workers. But that really increases the obligation on the government to enforce its laws. And I think the reality is the whole country isn't having a bit of a, it's having a bit of a pause in a sense after the World Cup. And I think there's that momentum has essentially been lost, and the pressure has been lost. There's obviously been huge geopolitical challenges and other things over the last year as well. But ultimately, it does feel like when the spotlight has gone away, the urgency and the impetus has gone. And Qatar can do this. It's one of the richest countries in the world. It has vast gas resources. It can invest more in this. It is a lot. It's not saying it could click his fingers and everything will be correct tomorrow. That's just not realistic. But it can do a lot more than is being done if the will is there.
Yeah, and in regard to the issue of wage theft, maybe you might be able to define for people who maybe aren't that au fait with actually what that actually means. But also, it seems one of the issues is the state is often the client of some of these companies, and then if there is, let's say, a delay in payment, it seems there is a domino effect, and the knock-on effect is felt down the line, all the way down to the migrant workers at the lowest scale.
That's right. So, there has been various sort of liquidity issues, I guess, within the economy, within the state, since the World Cup. But the people who pay for that have been the workers, because they're the most vulnerable and they've got the least power. And so if there is a payment issue, it is wages that are often stopped. So workers are under contract. They should be given a guaranteed wage. There's now a minimum wage in Qatar, but all too often companies will cease payments for a number of months. Sometimes they will just cut contracts altogether while wages are owed, or often they'll be made to work overtime and will not be paid for that. These are relatively common. They're not universal at all. There are plenty of companies who pay on time and correctly, but there are far too many companies who don't. We see just from the numbers of complaints that go through the labour courts, for example, is between 20 and 30,000 wage complaints every year. But that itself will just be a subsection of people who have faced issues, because there are many other people who decide to cut and run and feel they have to go home rather than fight months and months in court to get wages that they're not even sure they would get in the end.
Yeah, and then there's the issue of the non-objection certificate, or the NOC, of course, which was not required by law even leading up to last year. That had been repealed, but it seems that still some companies are advertising roles where they are asking for NOCs as well.
That's right. So one of the big and one of the most important reforms that Qatar introduced was removing what was called the non-objection certificate. So before 2021, I think it was, if you wanted to change your job, you needed your boss's permission to do so. Otherwise, you were stuck in your job, and that's really important for workers, because, if they want to escape an abusive situation, they were absolutely unable to do so. They couldn't, or even if they just wanted a better living conditions, they want better working conditions, like all of us want, that they weren't able to do so, and it put huge amounts of power in the hands of employers, some of whom would abuse that power. Now, that was removed, which was a really important step. However, it's been reintroduced in many informal ways. Now, in some companies, they still demand the government will still demand a letter of permission, which is essentially the same thing. You get many companies that advertise. We collected a number of job adverts you find online that essentially says this non-objection certificate is still needed. It's illegal, but it still happens. Or you find that otherwise, when workers have left the company quite legally to do so, that company will file a charge of what's called absconding, which is when essentially they've been accused of illegally fleeing a company, and that can put their visa at risk and put themselves at risk, and it can lead to deportation, and it makes workers very, very vulnerable, and it's a way that companies can use to retaliate against workers who leave or threaten to leave. So there's still a range of ways, legal and illegal, that companies restrict workers' movements and keep the bargaining power of workers low.
Yeah, and the overall impression I'm getting, of course, and I think as you talked about last year, and what seems to be the continuing problem is the enforcement of laws seems to be arguably the biggest thing. You mentioned some improvements, and they seem to have 2 new labour courts as well, which will deal with the backlog of cases. But is that still a bit of a drop in the ocean?
It's still, so there have previously been 3 labour courts, and these courts were set up a few years ago with the idea that it should be easier for workers. It used to be almost impossible, who have had wages not paid, for example. That's the most common thing that's brought to them, where they should be able to be treated in a short period, and either forces the employer to repay them, or there's actually a government fund that if the company is unable to, then the government will provide some money to the worker to do so. But it's been beset by problems in terms of accessibility. One of the biggest problems has been that backlogs of tens and tens of thousands of cases, and taking many months, if not a year, and sometimes more, for cases to reach the court. And then what happens is, in that process, is that workers who are desperate, perhaps they don't have a job going, perhaps they need to get home, they just take whatever that is offered to them by the company. So they might be owed $5,000, but they'll accept $1,500 and a flight home, just because otherwise they feel they won't get anything. So 2 new courts have been introduced just at the end of last year. That's obviously a good thing. That hopefully that will speed things up. Whether it's enough, it doesn't seem like it is so far, but it will be an improvement. And I think that's something that needs to. That's one of the small areas that you can say that something has moved. that court still needs to be made more accessible to workers. Very, very importantly, they also need to find ways for workers to be able to access that court if they've already left the country. So what happens in many, many cases, the workers go through a difficult period, they lose their jobs, and their companies essentially offer to pay them to go home, or they decide to go home themselves. And once you're out of the country, there's no real way at the moment to be able to access compensation. And that would be a huge thing for Qatar to do, and a really, really important thing that we think they should be doing.
Yeah, and given, of course, we're talking in the shadow of the World Cup, and obviously before that it was in the build up to it, and FIFA, of course, are the organisers of the World Cup who also awarded the tournament to Qatar. And I was in touch with FIFA. They did respond in regards to some of the issues in and around, the issue of migrant workers in Qatar. So this, before we expand on that from the Amnesty International point of view, just will mention what the FIFA spokesperson told me. International experts and trade union representatives who have assessed and collaborated in the labour rights programme for FIFA World Cup workers have repeatedly recognised that major steps forward have occurred in the labour rights sphere. According to the International Labour Organization, Qatar's labour reforms have been significant and benefited hundreds of thousands of workers, with the World Cup being an important catalyst for these reforms. It is undeniable that significant progress has taken place, and it is equally clear that the enforcement of such transformative reforms takes time, and that heightened efforts are needed to ensure the reforms benefit all workers in the country. And I remember last year, you told me that Amnesty had written to FIFA and in regard about the compensation fund, which was a big issue at the time, but that no response had been issued to you at that time. What communications have you had with FIFA in the meantime, in the year since?
So we have a dialogue with FIFA, and we keep in touch with them. The most important thing in relation to compensation, for example, that's happening at the moment, you can remember around the World Cup, there was a huge campaign from human rights groups, trade unions, players, sponsors, football associations calling on FIFA and Qatar to compensate the workers who made the World Cup possible, because they'd lost money, they've lost lives. There's huge losses that those workers endured and incurred to make the World Cup possible. And FIFA made $7.5 billion out of that tournament. So we felt it's fair that there is a compensation fund to repay. That was initially dismissed around the World Cup, just at the start of the World Cup last year, saying that there are mechanisms in place to deal with that, which isn't true. What happened since is that there's been some movement in the sense that the Norwegian Football Association put a motion towards the FIFA Congress in March of this year, calling on FIFA to look at ways to remedy migrant workers who faced abuses during the tournament. On the back of that, FIFA then committed to conduct an independent review into what remedy was needed, what compensation would be needed. That review is ongoing. The consultations have been happening. We expect that to be published end of this year, early next year, in the near future. And we, of course, hope that will provide recommendations to go forward. Now, whether FIFA then accepts those recommendations and actually starts delivering resources and a compensation mechanism remains to be seen, because that aspect, of course, becomes very political. But we think, according to their own policies, according to international human rights standards, and according to what we and many others have documented over the last decade, FIFA does have to provide real remedy for workers, real money on the table that starts to right some wrongs and starts to make real improvements in the lives of workers and their families who made the World Cup possible.
Yeah, and that was one of the things I did ask FIFA about, was in regard to this review. So this was their response from FIFA spokesperson. At the moment, the Human Rights and Social Responsibility Subcommittee is currently conducting an independent assessment on whether the steps FIFA has taken to date with regard to access to remedy of workers in the context of the FIFA World Cup Qatar 2022 are in line with FIFA's human rights commitments and responsibilities under relevant international standards, and whether additional steps would be recommended in view of further strengthening the tournament's legacy for migrant workers. This work of the subcommittee is currently ongoing. So aside from that issue, I remember on the eve of the World Cup, the FIFA president then, Gianni Infantino, there was that speech, I think, that went around the world, the "Today I Feel," and then there was usually, whether it's nationality or some other sort of identifying factor, he would add to the sentence. And maybe there was scope for debate. There were some criticisms he made of the nation, some of the more critical nations. Maybe there's scope for debate about hypocrisy, etc. But in terms of the human rights and the from your point of view, where you're talking about compensation funds, but this seems like it was almost like a defiant response and almost a deflection. What was your view, kind of, I suppose, the Amnesty view, listening to that speech?
At the time, it was we were extremely disappointed by that speech, because it was deflecting, it was conflating a lot of different issues. For a start, it was personalizing the issue into his presidency, and it was moving the discussion away from what are the abuses that migrant workers faced, and what are the responsibilities of FIFA to remedy that, which are according to their own policies, are clear. It felt like something that was polarizing. It didn't feel like something that was searching for solutions. It was happening, of course, in the heat of the moment of the World Cup. The debate was very fierce at that time, and that the fierceness of that debate probably prevented the ability to think about what could be done practically to fix problems. I hope we're in a different space now. I actually really hope that, now the controversies around the tournament have slightly died down, that we're actually able to look at this a bit more objectively and say, this tournament happened. It made a huge amount of money for FIFA. It happened on the backs of workers who faced abuses, and FIFA's own policies and its own human rights obligations say that it should be providing remedy and compensation. And now the question is, what's the best and most practical way to do that? To use just a tiny bit of the money that was made from that tournament to reimburse the people who made it possible. FIFA, they announced a legacy fund, for example, from the tournaments. We've heard really no information since then about what that will be used for. The last few tournaments, that has been worth about $100 million. What we have said is that should be a starting point and used to remedy to workers. It's good to invest in legacy, measures that help workers in the future, but we also have to look about remedy for the workers who were involved in this tournament, and using that legacy fund could be a practical way to ensure compensation and find a solution to the problem that we all know has existed.
Yeah, and then of course, as we move forward, so 2026, we know the tournament is taking place in North America, essentially between Mexico, United States, and Canada. 2030 has also been announced, and it's taking place across largely 3 countries, but we're going to say 6 different locations. And then 2034, there is Saudi Arabia. And given some of the human rights issues that I think have been well documented in and around Saudi Arabia over recent years and over recent decades, what's Amnesty International's view on that in regard to, lessons learned from the build up to Qatar?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think it's worth saying that the human rights principles and human rights standards that have been set by FIFA in line with international human rights law don't just apply to Qatar and Saudi Arabia. They also apply to the 2026 World Cup in USA, Mexico, and Canada, and also to the 2030 World Cup in Spain, Portugal, Morocco. Every one of these countries has human rights issues. Every one of these countries has human rights concern. And in every one of these countries, there is an opportunity to use FIFA's human rights frameworks and the sort of the leverage that comes with a World Cup tournament to make improvements. And that could be around police violence in the US. It could be around the securitization the militarization of security forces in Mexico. It could be around racism and sexism in Spain. It could also apply, of course, to the Euro 2028 in UK and Ireland. These are human rights principles that apply to every tournament, and the standards need to be the same. Specifically in relation to Saudi Arabia, we need to see those human rights standards applied. So the selection of the host hasn't been finalized in either 2030 or 2034 case. That will happen over a process over the next year. Each of these bidding countries will have to undertake an independent human rights analysis to show what the big risks would be of hosting a tournament, and will have to submit a human rights plan to say how they would overcome those. So, for example, in the case of Saudi Arabia, it should be fairly clear that an independent human rights assessment, if done properly, would highlight huge risks of exploiting migrant workers. It would highlight the fact that there is no freedom of expression in Saudi Arabia, that if you're a human rights activist, you will end up in prison or worse. It should show that trade unions are banned. It should show that it's illegal to homosexual activity is illegal. It would show that there are real risks to journalists who speak out. Now, those should be those should, you could write, this needs to be done properly, but those are clearly well-documented risks that ourselves and others have documented over many times. There are no great surprises here. What's really key is that Saudi Arabia takes this seriously to announce what reforms it might be taking in these areas. Will it work with the International Labour Organization on a series of labour reforms in the same way that the Qatar belatedly did? Will it revise its penal code? Will it revise its laws on freedom of expression? How will it welcome fans of every sexual orientation? That needs to be clear. And before something is awarded, before the tournament is awarded, there needs to be a binding commitment with FIFA on those issues. And that could provide a basis over the coming 11 years to make progress on those issues. The risk is, if those commitments are not made, then we face the same situation in Qatar, where you've got a decade of exposing issues, debating issues, and maybe getting some change at the end. Well, actually, there's an opportunity to get some change from the start.
Yeah, and as you said, 2030 and 2034 haven't been fully finalised, but I think the way the bidding process has been done for 2034, where it's restricted to a particular confederation geographically, and the fact that Saudi Arabia appears to be the only bid remaining, I think Australia had pulled out, means probably perhaps it is almost a fait accompli that it will be heading to Saudi Arabia. And as you said, FIFA has its own human rights policy, and even looking at the policy from 2017, what it states, FIFA appropriately reflects its human rights commitment in the requirements for the bidding and hosting of FIFA competitions, notably by including in such requirements a clause committing to the principles of this policy and takes human rights into account in the selection of host countries. So based on the reporting around human rights, would it be Amnesty's view that Saudi Arabia then, as you've said, would not be the most appropriate host based on human rights considerations as things are right now?
It would be hard to see how Saudi Arabia could meet FIFA's human rights standards without change. That's very, very clear. We and many of us will not say that Saudi Arabia should never host a World Cup or should never be able to bid for a World Cup. That's, it's a big footballing country. Football is very popular in the country, and there are changes happening. But currently, you could say that Saudi Arabia does not meet the standards set by FIFA and set by international human rights standards. That can change. So what will Saudi Arabia say and commit to, not just say, but really commit to and show proof of, that there will be changes in the country that will allow the tournament to take place without seeing violations of human rights and while driving positive change in the country? I think that is really what's at stake over the next year.
Yeah, and I suppose a final point, as you said, there's 11 years between now and then. We had a sort of decade-long, give or take, road towards Qatar, which a lot of things stalled and a lot of debate and argument. And as the report that Amnesty has put out, that even a year on, some of those lingering issues still exist and some of those debates continue. So if it's a starting point from now, and with the potential that Saudi Arabia is going to host 2034, what do you want to see from FIFA and also from the Saudi Arabian state in that time span?
So I think we would want to see clearly a program of labour reform in terms of Saudi Arabia has a very similar labour system than Qatar in terms of restrictions on leaving the country, changing jobs, risks of working in the heat in the same way. And in a sense, it's on a bigger scale. The number of migrant workers in Saudi Arabia is much larger. It's a larger country. The range of construction projects in Saudi Arabia is enormous. It's a bigger World Cup as well. There's greater infrastructure demands on the tournament. So we'd need to see a very serious program of labour reform. We'd need to see real commitments about reforms to freedom of expression, so that human rights activists are able to scrutinise what's going on, that they're able to monitor what's happening in construction and other issues in the country and speak about that freely, because that's just not possible right now. You could be, there's cases over the last year of women who've been imprisoned for decades, one woman for 34 years just for tweeting or even retweeting. Now, that is not a context in which you could do realistic human rights monitoring, and that is really important to know what's been happening. The one thing you can say about Qatar is they allowed us to come and monitor, to do research there. They allowed other organizations to come and global trade unions to come and see what's going on and to speak out. That was a really important thing about driving progress, and it's really a condition that we'd need to see in Saudi Arabia as well. And we'd need to see guarantees in terms of the safety of minorities, including the LGBT community. These are really, really important, that can't just be left to the end, can't just be, sort of a vague everyone's welcome. There have to be really clear legal guarantees around all of those issues.
Yeah, and of course, the report on Qatar that Amnesty International has released, it's called "A Legacy in Jeopardy: Continuing Abuses of Migrant Workers in Qatar 1 year after the World Cup." And Stephen, thanks very much for your time.
No, thank you.